Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and I'm here to talk about JavaScript in the web browser. If you have gotten to this lecture, then typically what it's going to mean for you is that you have learned a little bit about JavaScript in terms of what the language is, how to add up numbers, use for loops and while loops, and you've probably also learned a little bit about the DOM. The DOM being the document object model that is used to essentially make JavaScript interact with an HTML page. So you have your HTML page, which has lots of elements on it, and then you have JavaScript, which has been souped up and able to modify that DOM. That's what I'm going to refer to as web browser JavaScript. There's another type of JavaScript which is used with kind of Node.js, more scripting command line, that's talked about in other lectures as well. That's not really critical at this point. But both of those things are just JavaScript with some extra features on either end, right? So one of them is JavaScript where it can manipulate the DOM, the other one we worry about later. Today, though, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the JavaScript manipulating the DOM. In particular, assuming that you are already on your journey with writing that JavaScript, but the question is, where do you put that JavaScript and how do you include it on the page? Really short kind of pieces of information here. So the first question is, how do you include your JavaScript on a web page? Well, there's two main ways. You can either include it inline or you can include it with an external link. So I've got a couple of code examples for you here. The first example we have is mypage1.html, and you can see, while I'm missing some other tags here, the point is that this is how you include JavaScript on the web page itself. You can just make an HTML page, and I really need to stress this. This is an HTML file. This is not a JavaScript file. It's an HTML file that has JavaScript in it. If you have a script tag, which is always good to include, script type is text JavaScript, you can simply write your JavaScript there, and we can run that. So let's run that together. Let me just drag this into the browser for you. So you see here, if I open the console, here and I refresh the page, you can see it actually prints out 3. And that's because that's what the page does, right? It adds 1 and 2 and then it console logs that. So it does work. The other way that you can include JavaScript on your web page is to actually do it externally. And by that, we just include a script tag, but instead of actually putting stuff between the script tags, we just give it a source attribute and then a file location. This can be a relative file location or an absolute file location. In this case, it's a relative file location because these two files are in the same folder. So here, script type is text JavaScript, source is mywork.js. This is an HTML file, and then we have mywork.js, which is a JavaScript file. So the HTML file is now including the JavaScript file. And you'll see that if I open this web page, that similar thing here, we have the console. It still prints 3, but if we look at the page source, you can see that it's actually just a script tag that links to this file. So now we've kind of created something external. Now, the natural question is going to be, which one would I pick? And the answer is that if you are, there's some trade-offs. So if you're linking JavaScript externally, as in the second method we saw, one of the first things that happens is you actually see some improvements in performance when the browser cache is utilized. So what your browser does without you even realizing it is when you load an HTML page like my page 2, the browser will, when trying to load that page from the internet, say a server, it will always pull a fresh version of that page because it's the page you're loading. It might change. Well, not always, but nearly always, like the vast majority of use cases. However, when that page is being parsed, like processed by the browser, if it sees external links, the browser will often try and cache that. That means store a local copy so that it doesn't have to make a network request to a server, because that's just more and more files to collect, which is slower and slower, chews up your internet, etc. So you'll see that if we go to my page 2 here, let's try and analyze this together. You'll actually see that when I run this, see what I can find here. I don't normally use Edge for this, but basically what you'll often find is that this file here, because this is actually like what's loaded when the page is loaded, right? We load an HTML page and the JavaScript file. Quite often, the JavaScript file itself will actually be cached, and And that means that when the browser loads this page fresh every time, before it goes to fetch it, it's like, oh, I've already got this file, so I don't need to load it. So external can actually be quicker sometimes if you've already got the file. So if it's like a file that's just like on every page and every load, then it's actually good to make it external, because rather than having to include it as part of the HTML file every single page load, which makes the file bigger, which makes the transfer finitely slower, you've externalized it and allowed it to be cached. So that's a benefit of external linking. The other benefit is that it takes less time for your initial HTML document to load, potentially, because depending on where you put the file, so this one is like a maybe sometimes, because you've just got a smaller document to actually like load naturally, like to actually render. But again, that depends where you put it. The benefits of placing the JavaScript inline, though, are often I mean, you could go deeper on some of these topics, but the short answer is that it makes the initial network request, like it saves the initial network request, because naturally, like, the benefit you get from externally loading JavaScript when it's cached only happens if it's cached, and to get it cached, you actually have to load it the first time, right? So the benefit doesn't happen immediately. It only happens after the first time. What this also then means is that, as a general rule, you're probably encouraged to put your JavaScript in an external script as much as possible. You probably want to limit how many external scripts you do. You kind of probably want to keep it to a minimum a few files, because that might be in other lectures about why that's necessary. But generally, browsers are pretty quick at getting a few files, but if you're trying to load dozens of files, it can be quite slow. So you'd probably prefer to do that. One of the main instances that you would not want to do that is if you have some kind of JavaScript that is just like 1 or 2 lines of code. Like, you would pretty much never externalize this example because it's so little code. Like, the benefit you're going to get from caching is going to be so insignificant. Like, because a network request is also, most of the time, like a plane, is spent, well, not most of the time, but there's like a fixed cost in like taking off and landing, right? As in connecting and disconnecting and doing all those things. The size of the file, as that gets bigger, that consumes most of the time it takes. But for tiny files, most of that trying to get it is actually not going to be transferring data. It's going to be setting up a connection and whatnot. So it just doesn't really pay dividends to externalize this if like that's all the JavaScript that's on your page. In terms of, so that's how you include code, externally or inline. In terms of where to include code, if you have an HTML page like this one, you can include it in a few different places. You can either include it inside the head of the page, you can include it at the top of the body, or you can include it in the bottom of the body. Now, obviously, you could include it in the middle of the body, but I have no idea why anyone would want to do that. If you include it in either the header, the head tags, or at the top of the body, what happens in these cases is that your JavaScript will run prior to the page being rendering, because the way the DOM is generated and the page is rendered is it kind of just does it linearly top to bottom. So if the more stuff you have that has to be executed, this JavaScript, before you actually are building the page out, the slower your page build's going to be. For that reason, we tend to, as preference, put all of our scripts at the bottom of the body, because what happens is we want our entire page to load, and then as soon as it's finished loading, we can start spending all that time executing scripts. That's because if you think about how a user uses a web page, they're very sensitive to seeing some kind of action immediately. They want to see the page render and load, but they don't mind if it's not dynamic for a second, because most pages you load, like say a Facebook page, you just want it to load once. You want it to appear very quickly, even if it takes a second to load your timeline or populate your chat. So that kind of time to initial load is really important. So that's why we put all our scripts generally at the bottom of the page, so that we can get the time to load done, and then we can start doing our like more interesting processing. So on a web page, say, if I was to copy this, and let's expand out our my page 2 example, typically in a page like this, what you would do is if you had a script tag like this, you would be putting the script tag right here. So you'd have all of your normal stuff, hello, and your script tags would all be at the end of your HTML body. When would you not do that? it's really hard to think of too many examples, but generally speaking, the only times you'd ever do that is if you need some JavaScript to execute prior to the page even rendering. So, perhaps if you're writing some JavaScript that needs to make a network request to see if the user is a valid user before they even render the page, then that might be a scenario. But generally speaking, you're not going to come across that day to day, because most of the time, if you're not, like, let's say for that example, if you don't want to render this div until someone's logged in because you need to know they're logged in, a more common approach to take is to actually have this say loading or something like this, and then inside of your mywork.js, what you would do after that, let me just break this up into two windows, is in here you might actually then say, document.getElement by ID, and let's call it main page or something, dot style dot display dot inner HTML equals welcome. So let's imagine this is like logging someone in, right? You have to do some checks, which we're going to talk about in other lectures. But what will happen here is if I say, this div ID is main page, now when we go to load this page here, it'll say loading. Got a problem here. It'll say loading, but after this one is processed, I haven't saved the file. After this one is processed, it will immediately update the div. And you can actually see that there if you watch it like really closely, right? On some of the refreshes, you can actually see that like loading appear for a second. So that's actually the page rendering as quickly as possible, and then the JavaScript's executing and updating it. You'll actually see this if you watch a lot of websites. Like you'll get a lot of stuff, and then you might notice some things update very quickly. But that's kind of the normal way to do it. That's why we can still put our JavaScript at the end, because you might, again, be thinking, I need to put it at the top because what is on the page depends on what my script's output is. But you don't need to do it that way. You can do it somewhere like this. Give like a placeholder until you have more information. Or, in fact, you could, as you'll see in tutorials and other things, you could even skip this altogether and just build it with JavaScript at the end. So there's lots of options here, but generally we put our scripts at the end. So hopefully that gives some insight.